Today my guest is Eric Lawrence. Eric, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm a big fan of your work, but this is the first time I got to meet you, so I'm pretty excited.
Glad to be here.
I love Fiddler.
That's great.
How long have you been working on Fiddler?
So Fiddler started in the spring of 2003 and was kind of a personal side project for a couple of years and got bigger and bigger and started to get some serious downloads in 2008-ish, and Telerik bought it in 2012. So
Telerik bought it, and then you became an employee.
And then I started full-time at Telerik at that time. So I was a program manager on the Office team at Microsoft when I started, and I moved over to the Internet Explorer team after a couple of years. And when I first joined the Internet Explorer team, they said, "Oh, well, Fiddler, that's kind of neat, but we're going to keep you busy enough that you won't have side projects." And I said,
"You said game on."
I said that's one possibility. And then, checking in a year later, the entire test team was using Fiddler, and I said, okay, that went about the way I hoped. So,
so they actually saw some value in it for themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, this was early days, but it certainly got a lot more powerful. So overall, I guess that's just about 11 years.
That's so you were working at Microsoft the entire time you were building Fiddler.
Yeah.
But it is not a Microsoft project.
It is not.
It never was.
It is not. It never was. There was a little sort of squishiness around sort of employment agreements and whatnot in the early beginning. The original Microsoft employee agreement was effectively, we own everything you do. And then over the years, they actually sort of liberalized that out a little and created a program whereby employees essentially could have side projects as long as they're not competing with Microsoft stuff and so forth. And so that eventually got kind of settled with the legal department. So it worked out nicely.
And you were giving it away anyway. So
yeah, and I was giving it away. I mean, Microsoft is a obviously big, successful technology company, but they're mostly interested in products that are going to make them, $1 billion. And so something like Fiddler is kind of something that they wanted to encourage, but they didn't want associated with Microsoft necessarily, because it becomes something that some competitor is going to say, "Oh, we have a patent on looking at HTTP, and now you're violating our patent," and so forth. And so they were very eager to sort of clarify that yes, it's Eric's side project. He happens to work for us, but it's not ours.
They have a lot of lawyers there. They need to keep them busy.
Yes,
I keep saying they. It's actually we.
Yes,
I work for Microsoft.
Yes.
That's a mistake.
I mean, the legal guys at Microsoft have a lot of challenges. I mean, Microsoft is a big target, and that's something I'd seen over the years as well.
So I actually just did a show on Fiddler just a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you do know Ido Flato.
Yeah, it's actually funny. So Ido has been kind of traveling the world talking about Fiddler.
He lives in Israel, and I met him in Las Vegas.
Yeah, so he first came to my attention. I was invited to speak at a conference called DevSum in Sweden in 2012, which I thought was awesome because Fiddler as a side project was, certainly popular, but I didn't get to really do much with it. And they invited me to speak at this conference. So I'm speaking at this conference, and I learned that there was actually a conference in, I think, Norway the following week. And there was a talk on Fiddler. I'm like, wait, I'm here. Like, why am I not giving this talk? Who is this Ido guy? And so I thought that was really interesting that there was somebody that was actually speaking about this thing that I built. And actually, randomly, Ido came to Seattle and gave a talk about Fiddler in downtown Seattle like a month and a half later. And so basically I snuck into the back and sat in the back, and I thought, he probably has no idea who I am, obviously, because we've never met and whatnot. And so he began his talk, and he said, "How many people have used Fiddler?" And pretty much everybody raised their hands. And he said, "How many people have written script for Fiddler?" And most of the hands went up. And he said, "How many people have written extensions for Fiddler?" And a couple hands went up. And then he looked straight at me and said, "How many of you wrote Fiddler?" And I said, "Oh, my cover's blown." And so that's actually how I met Ido, was at his talk in Seattle. And so he's actually continued to go out and give those talks. And so he was recently at Dev Connections, I think.
That's right, man. Dev Connections.
Yeah, Dev Connections. And so we actually sent him off some of the marketing swag to give out at his talk as well. So yeah, he's a super guy. And it's funny because I wanted to see his talk in Fiddler, and it was actually quite good. So
no pressure though.
Yeah,
exactly.
The guy
that wrote us in the back of the room.
Yeah. And so yeah, I was happy to see that he was giving these cool talks about Fiddler.
All right, so we've been saying Fiddler now for about 10 minutes. Let's give the elevator speech. What is it?
So Fiddler is a web debugging proxy. It basically sits between your client application, whether it's Internet Explorer or an Office application or some sort of .NET client or Ruby or Node or whatever, and the internet. And so as a proxy server, it's able to see all of the HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, WebSocket, et cetera traffic. And because it's a proxy, it can actually change that traffic. And so that's actually how Fiddler got its name, was it allowed you to fiddle with traffic. And so I originally built it when I was working on the Office clip art team. And so we had client applications that would talk to a web service that would deliver clip art. And so sometimes those services would not deliver the expected results. And so Fiddler was sort of built to visualize that traffic and help our test team and our developers do a better job with that. And so that's where it kind of came from. And I picked Fiddler because the fiddling with traffic thing, and also because it would be really easy to come up with a logo for it, which for many years was a violin. And the current logo is, it looks more like a curly brace. What it's not actually a curly brace. What it really is a close-up of the corner of a violin that happens to look like a fiddle. But the marketing guys and the branding team are always on that sort of thing, so it will probably change again, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I like about Fiddler is that you could open it up and start using it right away. The step one, just monitoring traffic and seeing what's coming from this request, it's relatively intuitive.
Yeah, and that's one of the goals I had, was to build something that would be easy enough to use that fairly non-technical people could get started right away. At the time that I built it, there was Netmon, which was exceptionally complicated. It's actually gotten much better over the years, and Netmon 3 was quite good, and now they've moved on to this new product, which I fear is actually moving a little back toward complexity, so Microsoft Message Analyzer. Message Analyzer goes a lot more than just network traffic. It can show USB traffic and all of those other things. But Fiddler was designed to be sort of easy for the novice to get started and have a tremendous amount of power. And again, back to that sort of old computer software maxim of like, easy things should be easy and hard things should be possible.
So it's the hard things that are possible that I think I want to talk a little bit about today. It's not every part of it is intuitive. In fact, there's a lot of features in there that people that use it every day aren't even aware of.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, part of the challenge for Fiddler is the breadth of uses to which it's put. And so when I first built it, it was literally just for debugging clip art. And like, you could use it for other things, but the idea was to debug these services. And then shortly after we launched the first version of Office Online, we had just tremendous scalability and performance problems. And so I started adding features to Fiddler that would help you find performance problems in your website. So resources that weren't compressed and files that were being resent that didn't need to be due to caching and things like that. And so it took a pivot around 2004 into this performance analysis thing. And so I think I put on my review that year, using Fiddler, we were able to optimize the website and save I think it was $12,000 a month in bandwidth alone.
Wow.
In addition to obviously having a much better user experience. And so it then became this performance thing, and then I became a security sort of guy on the Internet Explorer team, and I took more of an effort towards security. And so Fiddler goes out in all these directions, but it turns out that what I was using Fiddler for was only a minor subset of what everybody else was using Fiddler for. And so it's really easy to build. Sorry, I shouldn't say it's easy. It's very possible to build a tool that is extremely intuitive within a narrow problem domain. And so, if you're building something that is going to send tweets at a particular time. If you're a good designer, it's relatively straightforward task to do that. And obviously there's genius level designers that are going to give wonderful user experience, but it's a user experience that can be relatively easily tailored. The challenge I have with Fiddler is that many of the things that I would like to do to sort of improve its intuitiveness would narrow its scope. And if I narrow its scope, there's a set of people that would be very unhappy about that. And one of the things about Fiddler is we're giving it away. And so we can't say, oh, well, these are the paying customers, or these guys are paying the most, or these guys are willing to pay the most, and thus we're going to tailor to them. And so What has mostly happened is we've started to sort of fork out niche things and say, well, this is a scenario that people are interested in and we could do better with. And so there's a class library called Fiddler Core, which is the core proxy engine behind Fiddler, and it's available to integrate into .NET applications. And so people who have very narrow scenarios like, oh, we're running a law firm and we need to audit access to all of a particular type of document to record for our billing system. Well, you could make that work with Fiddler, but obviously it's never going to be a mainline scenario that lots of people need.
Right.
But with Fiddler Core, you can go build your intuitive application on top of that.
Okay.
And then the other thing that's happened...
So people are taking the guts of Fiddler,
Yes.
the DLLs, and then putting in another UI and another application.
Yes,
entirely.
and sometimes there's no UI at all, because for their scenario, if you're building test automation, you don't need UI.
All right,
You
but
just
they wrap
want-
their own
yes.
business logic around
So
it.
they'll wrap their business logic around it. And then the other thing that people have started to do is build sort of experts or inspectors. And so an example I gave in my talk here at CodeMash was there's a company called Kasaba Security, and they do security analysis and pen testing and whatnot. And so they built a couple of plugins, including one called Watcher. And what Watcher does is it scans your site passively for security vulnerabilities. So essentially you navigate around your site and it will highlight things that it finds potentially risky. And it's extremely intuitive in that there's a tab that says Watcher and a list of here's all the warnings kind of pointed at whatever requests are potentially problematic. And so they're able to plug in that specific functionality for their scenario and just kind of expose it as a tab within Fiddler. And so, yes, there's definitely a very interesting trade-off between that sort of intuitiveness and power that we've kind of wrestled with over the years.
Tell me about the a feature that is in Fiddler and is awesome, but people aren't using it.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say, awesome is in the eye of the beholder.
In your opinion.
My favorite sort of feature in Fiddler, and I guess I would say that the way that I answer this question is, what is the feature that I've spent the most time on that is unjustified in the sense of usability or use? And I would say that's the quick exec box. So the quick exec box is this little black box under the session list. I would wager that the vast majority of people never notice that it's there and have no idea why it's there. Although there is a little tip that says type help for help. People probably just assume that's some sort of reminder for, oh, there's help files or something. But what quick exec actually is it's a command line to interact with Fiddler. So you can execute commands. You can tell Fiddler to begin capturing, stop capturing, save things off, break on particular requests. You can use it to control the session list. So you can select things based on their MIME type or their size or their response code and whatnot. And so, the amount of power per pixel in that box is exponentially higher than anything else in Fiddler. But most people don't know that it's there. And so that's one of the things that I always try to do in talks when I go to conferences is kind of show off like, hey, there's this thing here, it's a command line, so you're not going to get a bunch of menus and so forth, but the amount of power justifies the amount of time we spend learning it. And so that's the plan.
Has the product changed a lot since Taylor acquired it?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is that people, when it got acquired, there was a lot of like, oh wow, great, now I'm going to a real website. And it certainly did. It went from, the original Fiddler website was a copy of some HTML I had built for a class project in 1998. And so, as you imagine, it was not very good. The IE team would periodically take my websites that were all copies of this HTML and use it as examples of terrible markup they had to support. And so when I moved to Telerik, they actually built a new site out on Sitefinity, which is their CMS product that's vaguely comparable to SharePoint, but obviously different in lots of ways. And so now it's a very slick, professional-looking website. It does things like responsive design and all the other things that you would sort of expect out of a modern website. And so that changed a lot visually. Fiddler itself, for the most part, did not. And so, there were some people that were hoping for like a UI overhaul into WPF or, just general level of flashiness and so forth. And that's something that mostly hasn't happened, but there's been a lot of stuff that's been happening sort of under the covers. And that's one of the things that's kind of challenging when I talk to people about Fiddler post-acquisition is like, they're like, well, it didn't really, hasn't evolved as much as I hoped. And the answer is, well, it did evolve, but you just didn't notice. And so the core engine under Fiddler has gotten dramatically better in terms of its performance, in terms of its fidelity of traffic capture, so basically not having an impact unless you tell it to. The code quality is obviously much higher, and the maintainability is higher. As I said, the performance is much improved over where it was a year and a half ago and so forth. And so there's been a lot of stuff that's been happening under the covers. There's also been a lot of incremental stuff. And so one of the things I showed off in my session was the new session list allows you to do things that everybody expected it to do previously, but it couldn't. So you can right-click on the column headers and say, hey, add a new column showing this field of data. Well, previously you had to write code to do that, and the number of people that did that could probably be counted on 2 hands. And so now it's literally right-click, customize columns, and show me stuff. And so that's a feature that came on. That's very subtle. I mean, you wouldn't see it unless you right-click, but it's something that people expected to be there at the beginning, and now it's kind of delivering on that promise. And so overall, I would say that there has been a ton of change. The most visible, I guess, change, or the most interesting change to a lot of people, is supporting running on Mono. And so you can now run Fiddler on Linux on top of the Mono framework. And it actually works quite well on Linux. There's a couple of missing features. The scripting engine is not there yet, and a new scripting engine actually will be created for the Mono version just because of some limitations in that framework. Most people were most excited about the prospect of running on Mac, but unfortunately the WinForms implementation on Mac is not nearly as good as the one on Linux. And so in order to build a really good Mac version, we're going to have to build a new UI on a native toolkit or GTK Sharp, for instance.
Is Telerik using Fiddler inside of their other products?
Yeah, so Fiddler originally got acquired in part because Telerik makes a product called Test Studio. And Test Studio is a full-featured sort of web testing suite. And so the original features were around essentially automating browsers and performing tests and find this element, click on it, see what happens, etc. And then a couple of years ago, they added a load component where you can generate load and load test your website. And so they were using Fiddler Core to generate the traffic signatures that they would feed into load. And so that's essentially how they first started, became aware of me and became aware of Fiddler and so forth. And so in 2012, they actually approached me about acquiring Fiddler and coming to work for them full time. And it was very hard to leave Microsoft because I had tons of friends and I'd worked there for more than a decade. But we were excited about the prospect of moving to a new city and having a kid and things like that. So we made that leap in 2012, and that's where it's at. There's been some discussion with other folks around Telerik. So Telerik makes a bunch of really cool products like Just Code and Just Trace and so forth, Just Mock. And so there's been some discussion about, wouldn't it be interesting if we could integrate some of that into Fiddler and vice versa? And so, basically extend some of these products out further. And so those are kind of conversations that are.
Yeah, I've actually done a lot of work with Telerik in the past, and they just in the last 3 years or so, their product line has exploded.
Yeah,
there's a component vendor and
yep.
a CMS product.
Yep.
Whole suite.
Yeah, and they're mostly looking. If you look at kind of the public stuff now, there's a bunch of areas that are super interesting for them in terms of like Kendo UI, some of the stuff around Everlive, and kind of mobile and service components in the cloud and so forth. And it certainly, this is a trend that Fiddler has absolutely benefited from. In 2003, it certainly seemed like a fairly safe bet to bet on HTTP, but I never could have imagined the range of scenarios that are now being undertaken over HTTP.
Right.
And so Fiddler has continued to be relevant.
So any new exciting features that we should be looking out for that you can reveal?
Well, I can reveal everything, but the short answer is that, the thing that I'm most excited about is kind of making a little bit more forward progress on the alternate platforms. So getting Linux over to, the full power, the Windows version around the script engine, and that'll be a fairly short-term task. I'm excited about doing Mac stuff because it's an area that I haven't done before, but it's similarly something that's, kind of an unknown because I just don't know how that process is going to go and how close we're going to get. The stuff that I'm excited about is not necessarily the stuff that most people would be excited about. And so the feature I'm most excited about now is around improving the way that Fiddler does asynchronous things. Fiddler is currently a pretty thread-heavy application. I'll share this anecdote because I find it funny. In 2012, I think, the Visual Studio team, they had a team that was working on sort of asynchronous debugging. And they built a sort of a thread, the task view, I think maybe it was that team, that shows kind of what's going on in all the different threads. And they finished their project early, and they came to me and they said, hey, we're thinking about building some web-related stuff that we're going to build on top of Fiddler Core, Fiddler, and so forth. And we just wanted to let you know. I thought, oh, that's super cool. A team at Microsoft that's going to be building around what I'm working on. And I mailed them about, I think, 3 months later, and I said, hey guys, let me know if you have any questions. And they said, oh, we had to give up on that project. I said, well, that's unfortunate what happened. And they said, well, we started our project, and we started debugging Fiddler with our product and our new features, and we realized that they just don't scale because Fiddler had, in some cases, could have dozens and dozens of threads. And the scenarios that they had been testing their product on had a much smaller number of threads, and they realized that they wanted to go back and kind of polish out their core competency of what they were building in Visual Studio. And so, like, on one hand, they felt like, yay, I helped a Microsoft product, and on the other hand, they felt like, man, I must be totally using threads wrong.
It's a challenge.
And so Fiddler,
if you are, you're not alone.
And so Fiddler, the way Fiddler uses threads is not optimal. It works actually quite well for what Fiddler is, but as people are starting to integrate Fiddler Core into other scenarios, moving to a more modern asynchronous pattern is something that I think will enhance the range of scenarios that Fiddler and Fiddler Core can use for. And so that's exciting, if for no other reason than just getting to geek out at low-level architecture stuff is pretty exciting for me. And then I try to maintain sort of a range of things that I'm working on at any given time, so that if I get a little tired of something, I can move on. The one thing I will say is that enhancing the composer in Fiddler is an area of extreme interest, just because more and more people are starting to use Fiddler not to capture traffic from an existing client, but to test a web service for which the client hasn't yet been built, or do web API stuff or Node.js stuff. And the composer is something that allows you to issue requests out of Fiddler, but it was never really an area of significant investment before. But now that I see the number of people that are using that as their primary use of Fiddler, it's something that I think can probably do with, if nothing else, some UX improvements and probably some functionality improvements.
Okay, that's good. That's because I've used it a lot. Is Fiddler built in .NET?
Yes, so Fiddler is built in C#. It's about 35,000 lines. It also has a scripting engine which is based on JavaScript.NET, which is effectively an object-oriented version of ECMAScript. That's the part that's currently not running on Mono because they didn't port that over. And so there's about 150 lines of JavaScript.NET that actually is in the default set of Fiddler. So actually much of Fiddler's UI and so forth is driven out of the scripting engine. And so it's about 35,000 lines of C# and about 150 lines of JavaScript.
Okay. And you have an online presence, don't you?
So I'm at Eric Law on Twitter. I've got a kind of a frightening army of people that follow me on Twitter. I bet when I reached about 800 followers, I'm like, well, I guess I have to stop talking about sandwiches. And so it's
That's not a rule.
Yeah, I don't know. It just felt like I should be using that platform to say more interesting things. And so I can't guarantee I do, but probably won't find much on sandwiches anymore. And so I'm there. The Fiddler website's there. I maintain some freeware utilities that I've been building since the 90s at baden.com, B-A-Y-D-E-N. And then I actually have like 12 different domains. I'm an MVP for Internet Explorer, and so I've got a website that's kind of related to help on that. And I actually still maintain a blog over on MSDN, so IE Internals. It's a blog about sort of things in Internet Explorer that I find interesting as a technologist that don't necessarily always make it onto the main IE blog, because the main IE blog targets a much broader audience.
You're still updating that now?
Yeah, I am. I stopped for a while when I joined Telerik, but I was named an MVP in July of this year, and so I think
congratulations.
Thanks.
I lost my MVP in October of this year.
Going full time is not a bad way to lose it.
And you have a new baby?
I do. 6 months old. He's my side project.
That's his name?
He's Noah.
So you're a busy guy.
I'm definitely a busy guy, but going to Telerik has given me the flexibility, I think, to kind of work on Fiddler with as much passion and as excitement as I used to. But I do miss my friends in the Internet Explorer team and kind of the web community, the browser community, I think the browser security community. So I've been staying involved with things like the EWP and things like that.
I happen to know there's a guy on the IE team here today. It's Josh Holmes.
Oh, that's
I don't think he was there when you were there.
Yeah, he came over, I think, shortly after.
Well, I really appreciate the time. Eric,
Talk
thanks
to
so much.
Thanks. One of the challenges with having so many friends in technology is that you get a certain amount of fame that doesn't translate to the real world, and so I've had funny experiences where I get introduced to people who are in technology, and they realize who I am, and there's this moment of fame, and my friends who aren't in technology find this tremendously funny. And so I've been introduced as parties, to people who are in technology by friends. A couple of minutes later, the person realizes that I built Fiddler, and they just, they kind of go a little crazy. The same way I do when I meet people like John Skeet or Bill Wagner, and it's always a funny experience to see their reaction. Like, oh, you're so famous. No, I'm geek famous, and it's not the same.